People have hypothesized that you see more divorces also because women might have expected more egalitarian allocations of responsibilities, for example, within the home, that then end up not being fulfilled once the marriage takes place, once the children are born. And so you see this increase in divorces. So that's, it's a compelling, interesting hypothesis. Again, I think we need more evidence in order to know whether this is true. But my sense is, of course, in economies where women are earning now more and more similarly to men, and also the allocation of responsibilities within the home would need to also be more similar. And when that's not supported by the community and by society, that erodes the value of the marriage contract. That would be an explanation that I think might be interesting to explore.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stanford University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us.
Today we're speaking with Alessandra Voena, an Italian development and labor economist and professor of economics at Stanford University, whose research focuses on the economics of the family. We'll discuss her recent work on women's bargaining power inside households, how economists measure it, how to think about the causes and consequences of lobola, and how marriage practices differ between India and Africa. Welcome, Alessandra.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Alessandra, it's so lovely to have you on with us. And your work has covered a kind of wide range of areas looking at the economics of households, of labor, and of development. And maybe we can start off with one paper that touches on all of these, which is titled Women's Power in the Household. In this paper, you summarize this huge body of literature which talks about women's power, especially in low and middle income countries. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this piece as a starting point for our discussion.
Thanks. So this paper is a collaboration with Seema Jayachandran at Princeton University. And it's motivated by a growing body of literature across social sciences that has documented how around the world women's power within their household, so just within the home domain, of course there's also a lot of work about power in other domains, but our focus is in the household. How women's powers within the household is often quite unequal compared to that enjoyed by their partners or male members of their family. And so we begin by thinking about what it means to have power, and even just coming to a definition was a journey in and of itself, and discuss how economists have modeled it, and then try to organize this really vast literature that has explored from many different angles what allows women to gain more power and what the consequences of this power are.
If I can just jump in immediately with the follow-up here. I think that one thing I thought was really interesting is thinking about these conditions that facilitate an increase in power. Like there's resources, but also laws, social norms, institutions, and you talk about improving women's outside options. And so I wonder, can you give us a bit of a summary of some of these key interventions that you discuss that talk about ways to shift that power in the household that you found across all these different studies?
In the article, we review policies and programs directly aimed at targeting women within the household. So these would be, for example, welfare programs or cash transfer programs that explicitly target women. These have, a really long history in economics, starting basically in the 1990s with programs like, say, Progresa in Mexico, all the way to more recent studies where you even see a randomization of the identity of the ultimate recipient of the cash. So the initial studies in the 90s that argued that giving money to women could influence outcomes within the family above and beyond just the value of that cash, but also through empowerment mechanisms. Typically were studies based on, that were simply giving money to women. The alternative was no cash in the measurement. And so there's been now a lot of progress in this literature in that we have started to see studies that provide cash to either men or women within the household. So those are, I would say, the gold standard. And as we argue in the paper there, the results have been somewhat more mixed than perhaps what the consensus would have been before these studies were published. And so I think that led us to a journey of thinking about how circumstances in which the cash is given, which I think then inform also the role of policymaking, might matter a fair amount. And so giving cash alone for a long time was seen as, a pretty relevant intervention. But what does it mean to receive cash? Do women actually have control over these resources? Do they have the possibility of exercising their own agency in how this money is being spent? Do they have opportunities to bargain? Do they have outside option, threat points, including potentially both within, but also potentially outside the marriage? And so starting from that premise, then we started looking at other types of interventions that perhaps don't necessarily target women's empowerment per se, but then end up having, the literature suggests that they end up having impacts on women's power. And so these would be, for example, laws that equalize the right to inherit from your family, or laws that make divorce accessible. So both in terms of the possibility of walking away from the marriage, but also walking away with economic resources that were possibly produced jointly within the household, and that in many contexts are still difficult for women to access. And so I think in the end, what we realize is that a lot of circumstances need to fall into place for interventions to effectively target women's power in the household. It's a matter of property rights, of legal rights, jointly with explicit targeted policies.
These policies obviously are kind of affected in a specific context. And to what extent is the context in sub-Saharan Africa different from other developing countries? So what is it that the norms, the values, informal or formal institutions that economists like to call these things, but how are they different here? And given that I'm an economic historian, what do you think are the roots of these differences then? To the extent that they are different, what is the origins of this difference?
Thanks so much for this question. And I think context and history are essential to understand how policies work today. In fact, I think that it's also something that we try to emphasize in the article, in terms of emphasizing, in addition to the role of institutions and government policies, also the role of norms and culture being extremely important in shaping both the level of power that women experience in the home, but also how that power can change in response to policy. And so, of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity around the world, and there's also a lot of heterogeneity within sub-Saharan Africa. So your question's very broad. And I'm going to try to simplify based on my understanding of the literature and the time I have spent working on these topics. My reading is that compared to some regions of the world, as we also document in the paper, studies have suggested that women, on average in sub-Saharan Africa, seem to have, for example, more control over resources and more agency than what has been documented, say, in regions such as South Asia, for example. But again, this is within a context of extreme heterogeneity. The roots of gender differences in economic outcomes are very deep, and there's a lot of competing theories. I know you've had on the podcast my co-author and friend Nathan Nunn, for example. So as there are very compelling studies testing hypotheses that have to do with pre-colonial economic structures that have likely a very long-term impact on how the world works today. So the plow hypothesis, that's the one I'm referring to. But of course, there are also other hypotheses that both attempt in general to explain why around the world societies tend to, in general, see men as more suitable for working in the labor market and women for working in the home.
Just to interject there is the idea, just for listeners, is the Nathan's paper on the plow is the idea that, men with their upper body strength use the plow. They specialized in using the plow, and so therefore women were specializing in the house in terms of their reproductive ability, and so that's really the difference.
Thanks. That's one of the best studied hypotheses in economics. And I think it connects to sort of other hypotheses that in general argue that if you, in societies that rely heavily on agriculture, the role of women in production might have been more limited because of biological reasons. And then over time, even though those reasons have disappeared in the sense that men and women can broadly contribute to society economically in very similar ways, outside of jobs that require a lot of upper body strength. So even as men and women's ability to contribute to the economy converge, the role of these historical advantages might translate into social norms that tend to confine women more within the domestic sphere and men more towards the market sphere. A traditional economic explanation is comparative advantage, but even when that comparative advantage seems to disappear, you still see a lot of specialization. And I think other social scientists have been saying this for decades, and economists are now also coming to terms with the notion that social norms are likely to explain a lot of this specialization. Now, when you have this type of specialization, that can weaken the power of some agents within the home, because for better or worse, specializing in home productions, so in the domestic sphere, which is super important, by the way, it's an important contributor to society. And we know very well the value, for example, of human capital investments that take place in the home. But that type of specialization might make your outside option outside the home weaker. That could be one mechanism by which women's power in the home might be lower. Yeah. And so, connecting it to your question, and again, this is a simplification, but by and large, you think that in economies where women can contribute to economic production, particularly when also it is possible for them to be single, to run a home on their own, which we see much more in sub-Saharan Africa than other parts of the world. In those economies, then women might tend to fare somewhat better within the home. So the ability to choose your own partner, the ability to walk away from a partnership that is unhappy is not only valuable in terms of agency per se, but also translates into greater power within the match, within the marriage or within the household, which I think is an important point that you can see quite easily in economic theory. And I think it's also starting to emerge from studies in the data.
Yeah, I thought that this was really interesting, looking at this, to think that the intuition might first be just access to resources, but just as you show, all of these additional pieces change. I found it very interesting then that you were then also looking at, so what are the outcomes that we start to see if women's power is increased in the home? And you open with this really interesting justification why we should care about women's power. And you have three things that, like, there is an intrinsic value. Everyone values their own power for themselves, and so equalizing power is intrinsically valuable. But you also say there's an instrumental value where women with more power might be able to close the gap that they experience in other areas, given the example of health outcomes. And then what really interested me, and you go on to explore a little bit more, is an argument for a societal value, which is women might be more likely to invest in human capital of their children. And so their children benefit, but society also benefits by this kind of upskilling of the children, and that women might invest more in these areas. So could you talk a little bit about some of these effects that you find when women's power is increased and the impact of those effects?
So there's been a lot of interest in understanding whether providing more resources to women has effects on the economy in terms of greater investments in human capital. And that has been motivated by studies such as those in the 1990s showing that cash transfer programs that targeted women ended up also having very positive effects on children's schooling. And there's a lot of debate, I would say, both from a theoretical perspective and an empirical perspective, to try to understand whether this greater propensity to invest in human capital is indeed a structural deep trait or perhaps a feature of particular contexts and so on. And I think that's very important in the sense that you'll find, for example, studies that argue if you experimentally look at willingness to pay for books or other types of inputs in children, it's not obvious that women have more willingness to pay. Or that necessarily the notion that women may care more about children than men, I think, is not something that we should just assume is true or be willing to ascribe to biological traits and so on, right? So I think what we see in the data, we did a dive in this really broad literature of the impact of giving cash to women, is that it does appear indeed that giving cash to women is associated with more expenses towards children, but the results are actually quite mixed. This is not a consistent pattern that you see everywhere, but it is something that, in fact, when we actually looked at the evidence, it's something that emerged, we felt, from the overall body of evidence. But I would say, if you compare the evidence base to how much this view seems to be reflected in public opinion or sort of the opinion of policymakers and so on, the evidence is not as strong as what the discourse sometimes seems to suggest. And so more evidence might be helpful, but it's also, I think, quite relevant to try to ask why these differences emerge in some contexts. And I don't think I personally will be very satisfied with explanations that say that mothers love their kids more than fathers, or explanations of that sort. Of course, decisions about how to invest in human capital are quite complex and depend on a lot of, again, both policy, institutional, cultural factors that can work all together.
One of the differences that I find quite interesting within Africa, there's a lot of variation, as you said, within Africa as well, but largely within Africa, you see what we would call the lobola system or the bride price system compared to, say, the dowries of India. And you've actually studied both places, so you're the right person to ask about this. But firstly, why a bride price in Africa, roughly speaking, versus a dowry in India? And then secondly, what are the consequences? I've thought a lot about this, and perhaps this is a follow-up question, but what are the consequences of having to pay a bride price here? How should policymakers think about this? Is this contributing to women's agency, or is it something that we should be concerned with?
Wow, these are great questions and also complex ones. First of all, I've been absolutely fascinated by the patterns of marriage payments, particularly because of what they can tell us about how societies value different agents in the economy, different people, and how they organize themselves in the formation of the family, which is primary economic unit for decision making, right? Indeed, we see throughout sub-Saharan Africa pretty consistently in most places, we see lobolas, or sort of payments, going from a man or his family to a woman and her family, as opposed to dowries, which we now see very prevalent in India, for example, or other parts of South Asia, but historically also in Europe and other parts of the world, where it is the family of the bride that will transfer money to the groom and his family or to the young couple. And even there's a lot of complexity. Again, so there are several explanations for why different parts of the world have different practices. And I think they connect quite well to the general differences in gender roles. So some hypotheses, again, link to the notion that when women are seen as a productive input in the economy, since women tend to move into the lineage or into the community of their husband upon marriage, and that's a more universal practice around the world compared to the other way around, then having your daughter leave into a new family is a loss of a productive asset, to use heavily economic jargon.
Yeah.
And so that loss would need to be compensated. And so that's one interpretation for why you'll have bride price, particularly in communities where women are very productive in agriculture. While in economies where women are somewhat less productive, then inviting a woman into your home means she needs to bring her own endowment to support herself, by and large. And the amount of endowment that she can bring would be also contributing to her power within the new home. And so that's what you tended to see historically in Europe, and to some extent is seen as an explanation for what's going on in India today, although I think the practice there has also evolved a lot, and that's somewhat of a separate point. So there you can already see how society sees production and the role of different sexes in the economy ends up then translating into institutions that then matter a lot. And when it comes to lobola, I've been fascinated by this practice ever since, I think, doing my first field work in Zambia. At this point, we're talking about more than 15 years ago. I was interested particularly in fertility choices by family, and we were doing, this is with Nava Ashraf, my longtime co-author, we're doing interviews with parents, asking them how many, or aspiring parents, how many children they wanted to have. And many would say, oh, we'd like to have daughters because having a daughter is great. You get her to go to school and then you can get a higher lobola. And we thought this is really interesting, and I would say quite consistent with how anthropologists, for example, describe lobola. As I mentioned, it's a way to compensate parents to some extent for the investments that they've put in children, as opposed to how it is often characterized, which is not incorrect. Of course, then whenever you have an economic transaction, you're going to have incentives, and these incentives can be positive in some ways and backfire in others. In some work that I've done with Nava Ashraf, Nathan Nunn, and Natalie Bao, looking at bride price, at lobolas in Zambia in particular, and then also in Indonesia where bride price exists as well, we argue that the existence of these payments provides an incentive for parents to invest in the human capital of their daughters. This is not to say that these payments should be promoted necessarily. And in fact, a lot of literature has showed an association in some context with, for example, intimate partner violence or different phenomena that obviously have made policymakers concerned. But if you are going to promote, say, the abolition or the weakening of this practice, you do have to worry about what role that practice was playing in society. And so then you need to think, if you're removing a reason why parents might want to invest in their daughters, you have to worry about making sure that they have other reasons as well. In other work, we've also shown, for example, that the existence of bride price might be a reason why parents might want to retime the marriage of their daughters, particularly might want to push it forward in times of hardship in order to receive the cash transfer. So you can definitely see why these practices can be seen as problematic. They do, however, have really deep roots, and so one needs to evaluate them and think about what role they play when thinking about their overall impact on the economy.
I guess those of the listeners who has read my book, I taught this class a week ago, so maybe just to mention this, so my explanation is very similar to yours, but I attach the land-labor ratio, roughly speaking, the factory endowments, as one explanation. So South Africa is labor poor or labor scarce, India labor abundant, and that leads to this kind of different production processes where women's labor is really valued, reproductive ability is valued. And so that's the one thing I thought I'd add. And then I did want to mention an earlier paper that I wrote with Fran Marco Gracia, who was a postdoc here at Stellenbosch. And when Fran arrived, he's a demographer, economic demographer. We started looking at the old South African censuses because basically they'd never really been studied quantitatively. And what he then discovered was really something quite fascinating in that the sex ratio, which, as you would know, is usually like around 102 boys for every 100 girls, he just found, like, for Black South Africans, historically incredibly low sex ratios. So even up to 92 boys for every 100 girls, which surprised us because he basically said he had never seen this anywhere as low in the world, and it was consistent across 11 censuses. So we really struggled to publish this paper as an anecdote simply because no one believed us. No one said that this could in fact be true. We must have made an error, but if 11 censuses give you the same result, then surely there's something there. And we also, it's descriptive, right? We couldn't really attach a reason for this. But then we started looking deeper into this, and we found that anthropologists have actually pointed out that there are very low sex ratios historically across large parts of Africa. And so is this perhaps an explanation for this kind of value that women have? Is this something that's interesting and worth exploring, or is there an obvious explanation that we missed?
Nothing is ever obvious in economics until you look carefully at the data, right? But what you're telling me is fascinating, and I think it would be worth exploring empirically to the extent that's possible. In the sense, it may be possible to link the census data to the historical practice of bride price. There are some data sources that basically put together the work of anthropologists over decades, if not centuries, and try to turn that into data. The ethnographic atlas would be an example. George Peter Murdoch's. But I'm speculating, but I'm thinking, one, it could be a direct causal link in the sense it could be that the existence of this practice per se could encourage parents to have more daughters, or can invest in the survival of daughters.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's one hypothesis.
Yeah.
The other one is that the existence of this practice is a marker of societies that value women more. And when you value women more, then you might again be more invested in their survival. And I'm thinking, especially in communities where you have, for example, polygyny, there's more demand for women.
Exactly,
and you can actually sustain economies where there are more women than men. Of course, in general, sort of having missing men or missing women is a sad phenomenon either way, but I think it's really interesting to understand the underlying causes.
One of the consequences of bride price for today is the fact that given South Africa's incredibly high unemployment rate, it is very difficult for men to actually pay the bride price. South Africa's got, I think, 60% of our babies are born to a single mother, right? They don't really have a father. And this fatherlessness, many would say, is actually a consequence of not being able to pay a bride price. It might have historical roots in a setting that is very different from today, but it persists into the present with these different outcomes. So I would want to think about policy in that respect. Like, fatherlessness is clearly a really big issue. And if there is this cultural institution that persists, but is very difficult to, as you've mentioned, to break up or to stop, if that's something we should concern us, what do we do?
Thanks. This is super interesting. And I've read about this. I would say I've mostly read about this in the press, a bit less in terms of empirical research specifically on this topic. But I think there is, sort of an important point that Lina Edelund, an economist at Columbia, makes, and I think also echoed by Michel Tertilt and others, which is what seems to count a lot is who has the property right over the decision to marry, right? And so in economies where it is the parents who have that, then you tend to have these payments, but then you also have these agents deciding on behalf of their children, and in some cases exercising these rights or this control in ways that make them somewhat better off. And so that could be a case here where basically parents have the property rights over whether their daughter can marry or not, if I interpret what you were describing. And so that then potentially removes agency from the younger generation. And so I think that for policymakers, this is a pretty relevant issue, right? One is for what I was describing before, which could be, incentives, for example, to marry off your daughter very young, particularly in times of hardship. And the other one is just making it difficult for young men to access the marriage market with potential negative social consequences as well. I mean, there's work in political science, for example, about how difficulties to marriage can lead men into armed groups even, right? So I think this is a super relevant point. For policymakers, I mean, the big challenge, and again, is a lack of power that young women have over their own lives. To the extent that marriage as an institution can be mimicked by domestic partnerships, maybe that's one avenue, kind of strengthening the value of domestic partnership by, for example, granting alimony or other types of rights associated also with common law or domestic partnerships. Maybe that could be, for example, I think an interesting avenue for exploration. But I must say I haven't really seen empirical studies that try to address this issue, and I agree that it's fascinating.
I want to build on this conversation a little bit and maybe push back a little bit against you, Johan. And Alessandra, I wonder what you think about this. I'll speak here anecdotally. I've seen some qualitative research and seen some discussions about what I think we're seeing perhaps more in South Africa. women are choosing not to marry and are choosing to have children. And one avenue that may support this is there's a high unemployment, so men don't bring much economic value to the table. And there is some social support for children from the government. And so women are able to support children without a husband more often. It seems like this is actually an increased opportunity for women to choose against marriage, and that many women are choosing against marriage, especially in context of high unemployment. And it is interesting. I think that has huge social consequences for men because manhood is still achieved through marriage and children. But it seems to me in the more recent years, in a kind of complicated way, that access to womanhood through having children is not now linked to marriage. And that it seems that many women in South Africa are choosing to not be married, and there isn't a social stigma about that kind of limiting your access to, say, adulthood or something like that. Whereas for many men, access to work is their stepping stone to access to marriage and access to family and effectively access to adulthood. And so there's a kind of real growing difficulty around unemployment for men. But it seems that in the situation, it might signal a context where women are not forced into marriage and therefore are not choosing it. And so I wonder what you think about that, given your work that you've looked at, maybe back to women's power, legal rights, but also the ability to exercise the choice not to marry. Do you think that this kind of reflects maybe a growing societal dysfunction because the family is not there, like Johan kind of mentioned, fatherlessness or something like that? Or is this something that might reflect a growth of women's power? Or do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on this. It's such an interesting question, although again, pretty complex, and I think it calls for some speculation in the sense that we don't have a ton of empirical evidence on many of these topics. But so the retreat from marriage is a pretty global phenomenon. In fact, the economists talk about lack of marriageable men, quote in quotes, as an explanation for declines in marriage in the US, very much along the lines of the mechanisms you describe. There's also sort of a lot of accounts and qualitative evidence of similar phenomena also in East Asia, where high income, high education women might prefer to refrain from marrying at all. And in the cases where having children outside of marriage is frowned upon, they also refrain from having children altogether, which then obviously leads to a lot of interesting questions about fertility rates and so on. Again, here I'm speculating, but I think, one theme that emerges, again, in the literature on marriage and social norms is that when social norms constrain how much power women can have within the home, if it's harder to commit to egalitarian marriages from the get-go, perhaps refraining from marriage is a rational response to these norms. In fact, there's even hypotheses that in Europe you might see more divorces. You might see fewer marriages too, but people have hypothesized that you see more divorces also because women might have expected more egalitarian allocations of responsibilities, for example, within the home that then end up not being fulfilled once the marriage takes place, once the children are born. And so you see this increase in divorces. That's, it's a compelling, interesting hypothesis. Again, I think we need more evidence in order to know whether this is true. But my sense is, of course, in economies where women are earning now more and more similarly to men, then also the allocation of responsibilities within the home would need to also be more similar. And when that's not supported by the community and by society, that erodes the value of the marriage contract. That would be an explanation that I think might be interesting to explore.
I don't want to really go too much into depth, but I do have to ask, you've mentioned fertility and you worked obviously on fertility in Zambia, as you've mentioned before. We do have this, some might say global crisis, but let's say global trend in rapidly declining fertility rates. What is as the leading economist of the household, how do we get these fertility rates back to levels that at least reached close to the 2.1 level where we hope it should be? Or are we happy to see it plummet? There seems to be lots of potential economic consequences, negative economic consequences of these rapidly declining fertility rates. Is there any good policy that we know of that could work, and why not?
So these are hard questions. A lot of people are interested. A lot of economists and policymakers.
That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, and there's a lot of debate also about the roots of this, how persistent and how worried we should be. I would say One pattern that I see emerge in the debate that I don't think has as strong support is this notion that the entire decline in fertility can be ascribed to increases in women's empowerment or improvements in women's employment and so on. This is a global trend that's actually also affecting areas of the world where female employment is not very high or as high as you'll see in South Africa, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think the explanation need to be more complex, possibly also have to do with the value of investing in the human capital of children going up and making children a very time-intensive investment for parents. And so I think explanations, trying to make sense of the causes of this phenomenon is very important then for thinking about what type of interventions could help. And just to say, of course, economists are also split a bit on how worried we should be, in the sense that many economists argue that if the population systematically shrinks, that's going to put a lot of pressure on pension systems and welfare systems in general and in innovation and so on. At the same time, you also have societies where many agents that used to be excluded from economic production, such as women, for example, are now contributing, right? So that's a force in terms of innovation and so on. That's a force that hopefully can help compensate. So I don't think that the solution is going back to a world where women are not economically productive. First of all, I think the cat is out of the bag, but also I think that can backfire even more because we need those productive agents in the economy, whatever their sex is. But yeah, I would say one potentially, I don't want to say entirely promising, but perhaps reassuring factor is that we see a big shift in the timing of fertility towards later stages in life. And so it's not, I don't think that we're sure yet that this is a permanent decline in the total number of children that women will have, or if a lot will be coming later in life. And there's a lot of investments to support women's fertility towards later stages in life. I think it's a complex issue, whether that's good for women in the long run or not. But I think making it possible and easier for women to fulfill their desire for children also later ages in life might be one way to contrast this trend. But my sense is, we don't have a silver bullet at all in terms of policies that we know are going to work.
Connected to this, I want to jump to another paper, but in light of this discussion, the broad question I want to ask is the cost to women for having children. It's interesting to think about bride price as a return on having children. So I'm thinking here about a paper which is titled Childbirth and Firm Performance Evidence from Norwegian Entrepreneurs, where you look at both men and women entrepreneurs who have children and the outcomes for their firms. And I thought that this was quite interesting because I assume that Norway is a context that has got a lot of institutional gender equality. And yet you find that I think you have something like a 30% decline in the productivity for female entrepreneurs and their firms compared to no decline or even increase for men in their firms. And I think that this is also particularly interesting because, as you say, this is not employer discrimination, which is one mechanism we might think might drive impacts for women. And so you talk about a number of different mechanisms that might be driving this, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the mechanisms that you see driving this impact, and maybe just to speculate more broadly, how do we think about the benefits and consequences of child rearing for women and for women's power and society more largely?
So in this study, we tried to take a somewhat different perspective to the question of how giving birth affects women's economic outcomes or economic outcomes in general. In that we know quite well from literature from all over the world, including South Africa, that women's earnings tend to take a really substantial hit in the years following birth. And in some settings, the women's earnings never really recover to the pre-birth levels. But this is something that happens to the family income. A separate question is how do firms cope with these types of shocks? And in particular, when you're thinking about an employee, that's a really important one, which is the entrepreneur, the owner, in many cases, the founder of a business. Typically a small business, there's many more small businesses in the data, even in Norway. So we look at this question in Norway, which is, I think, ranked as the most gender egalitarian, or perhaps second most gender egalitarian country in the world. So if we see that happening there, we felt that should motivate looking in other settings as well. And in fact, other researchers have shown something similar in Canada as well, for example. So what is happening to the firm? And so now the outcome is not how much money are women bringing home when they're possibly substituting their work in the market with work that they do at home with a child. Now the question is what happens to the business that the woman run and potentially with its employees and so on. And that's where we see this really substantial decline in firm profits. So we see a 30% drop in firm profits in the years following the birth of the first child of a business owner, which tells us potentially two things. One is that these entrepreneurs have to withdraw some of their time from the firm, and that time is really valuable and hard to replace. In the sense you can't hire someone to substitute for the entrepreneur, even in the medium run. You don't sell off your business to someone else that doesn't have these same constraints. So that's quite relevant in that it tells us then that there could be an effect on the overall amount of economic production that comes from this reallocation of time. And again, children are very time intensive. I think a broader question is this unavoidable? Or so something that we see is there's a little bit of protective effect of having a spouse who doesn't work if at the time of the birth. There's also somewhat of a protective effect of having a co-founder, but I think overall quite limited. And let me also add that firms owned by male entrepreneurs who have a child experience no change. So that's telling us something about how families are choosing to allocate the time of men and women towards children. It would be really interesting to see this replicated in different settings with different institutions and so on. But it does seem that families are, by putting pretty substantial time burden on mothers more than on fathers in the early years, are making decisions that seem to not only affect families, where you can reallocate resources, but also are affecting production, the economy, and so on. And this may be part of the sort of broader literature that tells us that norms that constrain women more to the domestic sphere and men to the labor market, irrespective of skills and talent and comparative advantage, might actually hurt the overall economy.
Alessandra, we're running out of time. We have two traditions on this podcast. I'm going to skip one of them, but I'm going to replace that tradition with a new one, and that is to ask you a question related to that tradition. Can large language models be female?
Oh, interesting questions. Large language models answers will depend on the data they've been trained off. And so a natural question is how much of that training data has been produced by men relative to women? And historically, for a variety of reasons, men have tended to produce much more of the written content that you can train these models on. I'm thinking about from domains such as literature to scientific inquiry and even probably Reddit posts, although I haven't seen data on that. But
I wanted to say Reddit is probably the most important one. Yeah,
I suspect. So I would like to see more research on this, but I suspect that the voice of these LLMs is probably somewhat more of a male voice. And I think there's only hope that as women produce more content, as opposed to LLM. So, we need to make sure that humans keep producing content so that these models can keep being trained on data sets that are more and more egalitarian. And of course, I'm not only thinking about gender there. We need to think about a lot of other topics. And I'm a really big fan of what you often write about, which is the importance, for example, of research about Africa also being produced by researchers who are from Africa. And that's true in so many domains of the sciences.
A slightly unrelated point, but I think Scott Cunningham wrote about this one female author, fiction author, who has suddenly scaled up her novel production from 2 or 3 books a year. She writes romance novels to like 30 books or something, 300 books or something using ChatGPT. She's clearly profiting from these large language models, despite them being, male. They're at least trained also on some of these romance novels, I suspect. The second tradition we have is to play you a song about your research. And so this was a very hastily put together song, I must admit. I asked I think I asked ChatGPT for some lyrics based on 6 of your most recent papers, and then inspired by kind of folk music in the US. And then I asked Suno to make a little bit of a song with some, again, string, guitar, and maybe some Zambian traditional elements. So let's see how it goes.
It's amazing.
We ask the room and nearly all say yes, but still we whisper no and second guess. We live by what we think the others knew, and fear a frown that never quite came through. The soft mistake, the social sleight of hand, turns common ground to something hard to stand. Tell me what you think, and I'll tell you mine. We'll set it on the table, line by line. If the rule is only shadow, let it fade. If it's only silence, let it be unmade. Sing it low, sing it true, sing it slow. We can change the world by what we let each other know. A school is far, a uniform is dear, but hope can grow when futures feel more clear. In some homes, marriage payments tip the scale, so books become a kind of bridal tale. A classroom built can open up the gate, but customs choose who walks through it and wait. A farmer counts the seasons in the soil, in sweat kept back in careful kinds of toil. If land may slip away when grief arrives, you guard your hands while somebody survives. Less seed, less rest, less care for what will be, when tomorrow's deed is someone else's key. Tell me what you think, and I'll tell you mine. We'll set it on the table, line by line. If the rule is only shadow, let it fade. If it's only silence, let it be unmade. Sing it low, sing it true, sing it slow. We can change the world by what we let each other know. In clinic light, the risk is hard to name. When trouble comes,
Any thoughts, Alessandra?
I must say I'm more of a rock fan, but this was
okay.
pretty brilliant. I'm going to ask you for the link.
No,
My
sure.
students will laugh. That was brilliant.
I just want to thank you for joining us. We recorded this quite late in the evening, so I appreciate it. You're based in Stanford on the west coast of the US, and we appreciate your time in joining us, Alessandra. Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with 2 more episodes for this season, and then that's the end for season 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. That was really great. Thanks.
Yeah, it was really wonderful to have this conversation with you, so thanks for coming on.
Thank you for listening to another episode of season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Fasti Karlitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andre Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.